All right, guys. Hope you are tuning in. I'm going to give everybody a little bit of time to tune in. I'm going to tweet the link to this as well. Post on the Swamp 24/7 message boards, and then we'll get started. I've got a couple questions already queued up from Swamp 24/7 subscribers. So bear with me a minute. If somebody could let me know if the audio is good, it should be fine. But first time streaming live on YouTube, so just give me a heads up in the chat if the audio is good, and then we'll go ahead and start talking Florida football, basketball, really any kind of questions you guys got. So let's get it going. All right. So the first question I have here is from Gators Media on the swamp247.com message boards. Question for the video today: are there any targets that Florida is pursuing at the moment, or is there no one that we're currently interested in the portal at the moment? I'm going to assume that that is a basketball question. And right now, obviously, Florida has already taken 2 transfers in from the transfer portal in Brandon McKissick, a guy that scored 17.2 points per game at UMKC. So that's obviously, I think, a big addition for Florida. He's a lights-out shooter from beyond the arc. The other guy that they've added is Boston College forward C.J. Felder. He's a guy that's a pretty balanced scorer, rebounder. I think really will add some athleticism to the lineup. And then there's 2 other guys that I know for sure that Florida has been in contact with. And those 2 players so far are Texas Tech guard Micah Peavey. He's a guy that was a freshman this year, a guy with a lot of length, even though he's a guard. He's a 6'7", 215-pound player. Averaged 5.7 points per game and 3.1 rebounds per game last year for the Red Raiders. So not maybe as prolific as some of the other guys that Florida has either already landed or is also pursuing in the NCAA transfer portal. Maybe a guy that you would compare a little bit more to a Colin Castleton type in terms of the amount of production that he's had so far at the college level. I think a little bit more of kind of a growth prospect, a guy that you get in and can develop him for a couple years, more so than a guy that's, really proven like, a CJ Felder or the other guy that Florida landed, Brandon McKissick. So the other guy that I know for sure that Florida has been in contact with, they had a Zoom call with him Monday with Mike White and some of the other basketball staff, is Furman forward Noah Gurley. He's a 6'8", 210-pound guy. We've talked about him a little bit in some of the previous videos on this channel. He's a guy that can step out to the three-point line and really offer you some ability to stretch the floor, I think, as a forward. Kind of a guy that a lot of teams are after in the transfer portal. Has some really, really big schools involved with his recruitment. Released a Final 8 last Sunday, and Florida was one of those teams. He's planning to meet with all of those 8 finalists this week via Zoom. He's already done a couple of them, including, like I said, he met with Mike White and the staff on Monday. I take that as an indicator that he's very interested in Florida. Mike White was one of the first guys after he announced that Final 8 to get him on a Zoom call, continue to talk to him. Not the first time that they've talked, but he's a guy that Florida's certainly interested in. He scored 15.4 points per game last year, 5.8 rebounds per game, and then, really kind of filled it up, even had 2.5 assists per game, a block per game essentially. So he's a guy that's very athletic. A lot of teams are after. I'm not exactly sure where Florida stands, but I do think Florida feels okay with where they stand at the moment. He'd be another big-time addition. And I think the one thing you see Mike White really trying to do right now is really go after some length. Everybody that they're recruiting, whether it's guards or forwards, has a lot of length. And I think you're seeing, I think Mike White, after a couple of years in the SEC now, seeing the teams that they've really struggled with, typically it's been those really lengthy teams. You look at the Mississippi State game this year, those bigs gave Florida a lot of trouble inside. And, despite the fact that Colin Castleton had a pretty good year, you'd like to see some more guys that you can start to pair with him. Omar Payne couldn't really develop that consistency to be able to be a second guy that they could do that, even though they had some bright spots when they were both on the floor. I think what Mike White's going after in the transfer portal is not just length at guard, but really, some length in terms of the front court. Guys that can potentially stretch it out to the three-point line, but also are very lanky and can get in there and block some shots and really be a defensive nuisance. So again, guys, if you're just joining in, this is a free Q&A, so feel free to ask anything in the YouTube chat. I've got the chat open on my screen. I'm ready to read questions. I've got a couple questions that have already been submitted on the Swamp 24/7 message board. So until I start getting some questions in the YouTube or on Twitter, I'm going to go ahead and answer those first. But I want you guys to really feel like this is interactive. I want you guys to feel like you can talk to me. And if you disagree with something I'm saying, let me know why, and we'll talk about it. Because I think, the more we just, kind of have that open discussion between Florida sports, I think the more you can pry out of me in terms of why I think certain things or, where I'm at on certain things. So, if you're tuning in, be sure to drop some questions in the chat and we'll continue to get to them. I've got another question here from John Jeans Jean, and his question is, where is the trap game on the schedule next year, if there is one? And I pulled up the schedule a little bit earlier, and I was looking at it. To be honest with you, usually there's like one game that I automatically circle, either because they've got a bye right before they pick up Florida, or Florida's coming off a tough road game at like an LSU or an Alabama or something. I don't really see a very obvious trap game on this schedule. I think that there's two maybe that stand out. I'll just go ahead and read the schedule first. Florida Atlantic, South Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, Vanderbilt, at LSU, Georgia, at South Carolina, Samford, at Missouri, Florida State. I mean, to me, there's not a whole lot there. You've got every road game is spaced out with at least one home game or a bye in between. You've got a bye before the Georgia game. The game after Georgia is at South Carolina. I don't think the Gamecocks are very good. So to me, if I'm looking at a trap game next year, and this might sound crazy because I don't think Tennessee's that good, I think Tennessee, coming off that Alabama game, has the potential to be tricky. I think because of this style change that Tennessee is going to go to with Josh Heupel there now, they're going to be a quick tempo team. And one of the things that we've seen Florida struggle with over the last couple of years defensively is up tempo. I mean, that was one of fans' biggest issues last year. Todd Grantham seemingly couldn't get them to line up in time. That caused a lot of issues, a lot of busts on third down. The one thing for sure, even though Alabama's breaking in a new quarterback, is Alabama's going to be very physical. And so you're going to come out of that game, win or lose, probably pretty beat up. Now you go against the Tennessee team where you're going to need some legs under you because Josh Heupel likes to run really, really fast. To me, that's a potential trap game. And then I think, if you manage to get through those two games, the game after that at Kentucky and Lexington, the way Kentucky's played Florida the last couple of years, to me, that's going to be a tough one. So those are kind of the two I'd schedule, or circle early in the schedule that maybe jump out to me. I don't really think any of the other ones really are going to present that many problems. But all right, let's get to the next question. I got Victor Core in the YouTube chat. Why do you think so many players have left the basketball team? That's a tricky one. I think it's happening everywhere right now. I think when you have what everybody is expecting to be a free year of transfers, anybody that is in a situation like Noah Locke, where you've got, a situation where you've been okay at Florida, but you haven't necessarily established yourself as a guy that's clearly going to make the next jump. I think when you get that one-time transfer to go anywhere you want, and, you've got a pretty good track record of being able to shoot well, kind of be an assassin, I think you can have the opportunity to find the right fit. And so for a guy like Noah Locke, I think his transfer is probably more about having the opportunity to do a one-off transfer this year as opposed to normal. And I think that's why you see a guy like him go. As far as the other guys, Quez Glover, I mean, anybody that watched Florida play, super nice guy, but just I didn't think had the skill level to really hack it at the SEC level. I think we saw that, just given his turnover rate, that kind of thing. I'm not sure that he's a guy that really was up to snuff from the SEC level. I'd expect he'll transfer down to a little bit of a smaller level. In terms of Omar Payne, I think Omar Payne was a guy that never quite saw eye to eye with Mike White. I know that Mike White constantly, every time Omar Payne would come in and turn in a good game, you'd start to hear rumblings behind the scenes that, Payne was late to class or wasn't showing up to a workout, that kind of thing. And that really rubbed Mike White the wrong way. And so I think those two kind of butted heads a little bit. I think you're going to see Omar Payne, he's going to Illinois, obviously. I don't know how he'll do there, but I do think, I think he was a guy that just didn't fit well with Mike White. And I think when you have that level of talent, you've got people in your ears. I think, that probably led to that transfer. And then, Osai Osifo, I don't think was contributing a whole lot. Gets an opportunity to go to Jacksonville with Jordan Mincy, a guy that he's familiar with, and probably, again, like a Quez Glover, a little bit more in line with his skill level, rather than a place like Florida. And I understand that, some fans will take that as, okay, well, why are we taking these guys if they're not Florida talent? And that's a valid question. That's a valid question that Mike White's going to have to answer. To me, I think maybe the most concerning of all of the guys that are leaving is probably Scotty Lewis. And the reason that's concerning is because I don't think he developed as well as he should have. He's a former 5-star prospect, extremely good athlete, but I don't think we ever saw him really develop the kind of technical basketball skill that he needed to. You'd see it in spurts, but there was never any sense of consistency. He's probably the one to me that jumps out as, the biggest, I guess, indictment, if you will, of guys leaving. And but I mean, like I said, the amount of transfers that are happening, that's happening everywhere this year. I think it's a product of COVID-19. I think it's a product of one-off transfer rule probably going into effect. So I don't necessarily know that I worry about that. For me, the worry about the basketball program is more, how do you rebuild it going forward? Can you get a group of transfers, and I would think that are going to be very good transfers. How do you get those guys to mesh going forward? I think that's the big question to me. So again, keep dropping questions in the YouTube chat. I'm going to get to a couple more from Swamp 24/7 on our message boards. And you can, if you want to leave me a question, you can drop them in from the message board at Swamp 24/7. I'll pull up my Twitter as well and check to see if we have any there. I tweeted a Mike White appearance on an Arizona hot board though, so my Twitter's blowing up a little bit. Kind of have to scroll through for a minute or two. Okay, let's get a question from Swamp 24/7. With the Alabama game being in September and Georgia being around Halloween like it always is, do you feel like Bryce Young being fresh off his freshman season with limited snaps and Todd Grantham struggling with veteran quarterbacks, do we have a better shot at beating Alabama? And how do you see us finishing in the division? I'm going to start with the first part of that question. I think having Alabama early in the season is a good thing for Florida. Having said that, I think my reasoning for that is that defenses typically are ahead of offenses early in the season, particularly when you're breaking in a new quarterback. And that's going to be true not just for Alabama, but for Florida as well. Florida's going to be developing Emory Jones, but I think Emory Jones has had much more time in Dan Mullen's system at this point, much more time kind of, getting reps, getting used to how it's going to look. And I think, excuse me, I'm about to sneeze. I think not only that, but Dan Mullen is very good at putting together a cohesive offense and usually doing that pretty quickly within a season. So I think that 3 games in, that's a good time to catch Alabama. I mean, there's never a good time to catch the Tide, but if you're going to do it, you want it early in the season, particularly in a year where they're breaking in a new quarterback. You've got them at home. That to me is a real chance for Dan Mullen to make a statement. I thought, forget the 3 games that Florida lost at the end of the season and how they unfolded and all that. I look at Florida's program and where it's headed, and the biggest thing to me is this is not the Jim McElwain era at Florida. Now, from a recruiting standpoint, you can make the argument that it's a little too similar, but from how Florida's looked on the field, this is a different program. I know that Florida finished 8-4 last year. I know that they lost their last 3 games of the season last year, but Florida was actually competitive in that SEC title game against Alabama, even with a horrible defense. That's something we never saw from Jim McElwain's teams when they got to Atlanta. Now the question is, you have a bunch of turnover on the roster, right? That's where you get into recruiting. Have you recruited well enough? Well, I think on paper, probably not. But this is a chance for Dan Mullen to make a statement in a year where Alabama's also breaking in a new quarterback. Can you go and at least be as competitive as you were in the SEC title game? Make that a game into the fourth quarter. Give yourself a chance to win. And if you can do that, I think you're on the right page going into the season. It won't sit very well with fans because at that point you'll have lost 4 of your last 6 games. That's not a great look. But again, 2 of those would be against Alabama. Another one would be a bowl game where nobody really played. I think you want to see Florida be competitive in that Alabama game. That's the biggest thing I look for. And I do think having them early certainly gives you a chance to do that. As far as how Florida's finishing in the division, and I'll try to answer these questions a little bit quicker because I see more coming in the YouTube chat now. I still think Florida's probably first or second in the division. I think, the Alabama game makes it tough because if you drop one more after that, it's pretty unlikely you're going to win the SEC East. And unfortunately for Florida, I think Georgia, if I'm talking about this offseason, I think Georgia's ahead right now. I think from a recruiting standpoint, the fact that they're bringing back a quarterback that was pretty good towards the end of last year, I would have to pick Georgia right now if you asked me. But I do think that's going to be a battle. And again, if you can spring an upset of Alabama, all of a sudden I think, you've got a chance to potentially win the division again. So another question. Let's get to one from the YouTube chat. Goldkamp, I've done a ton of research and I see Florida as a 9-3 with a 4th loss likely team in 2021. My question, can Mullen survive a 4-loss season? I think yes. I think it depends on where those losses are and who they come to. So let's go ahead and say off the bat that Florida loses Alabama, LSU, and Georgia, but none of them are like bad games, right? And we're expecting that LSU takes a big step forward. 3 losses there. If your 4th loss comes in a bowl game, I don't think that matters a whole lot. It's definitely not going to leave fans happy. People would be pissed. But I do think, if what happens is it unfolds in a different way, say you lose to Alabama and you get by LSU and you manage to somehow beat Georgia and then you drop a game you shouldn't, and I don't think that's likely, but say that trip to Missouri maybe Missouri ends up being better than you expect late in the season in November, then I think fans get really upset. So it's more how it looks if you go 9-3. Look, Dan Mullen, Scott Strickland has made it very clear, I think, with Mike White, that he believes in patience. Now, the math's a little bit different when you're talking football compared to basketball, just in terms of how quickly fans will turn in football if you kind of cross that Rubicon threshold line. I think Dan Mullen will get at a minimum a fifth year. It's very hard for me to envision a scenario where Dan Mullen doesn't get his fifth year. There's been a little bit of tension between him and Scott Strickland that I've, heard from inside the program, but I don't think it's anywhere like it was with Jim McElwain. I don't think Florida's necessarily looking to move on from Dan Mullen. I think that there's at least 2 more years of Dan Mullen. I don't think there's any question. To be honest with you, I see Florida more of as a 10-2 team than a 9-3 team, if you had to put me on the spot right now. And so I'm looking at that question a little bit more from the optimistic end than thinking, a fourth loss is more likely than just 2. So if that makes sense, I still think Dan Mullen gets another year. Let's take another one from the YouTube chat. How do you think our secondary style of play will change with Jules Montanar and Crown Dog coming in? More aggressive? Jacob, I think absolutely it's going to be more aggressive. Every player in the secondary we talked to this spring was talking about how they were playing more press man, how they were being more physical at the line. That jives with all the reporting we got on out of the scrimmages and that kind of thing. I don't think there's any question that Florida's going to play a lot more press. I think that was one of the things that Dan Mullen really identified during the offseason, or I guess it really wasn't even much of an offseason, but during their cut-ups in January when they weren't on the road recruiting. He said, hey, we got to get this fixed up. This is a big part of the problem. It's part of the reason third downs were so easy to convert, in addition to the fact that they weren't getting lined up in time a lot of times. So I think those are the 2 points of emphasis on defense. I think it's going to be play a little bit more physically in coverage, and then also make sure we're getting in there, getting the calls quick, and getting lined up. Now, how that looks, I don't know. You've got a young secondary. We heard really good things about Jason Marshall in the secondary this spring. I think Kyrie Elam is going to have a breakout season. Jaden Hill, I'm not exactly sure where I stand on him. He's one of those guys that's a little bit inconsistent. I think at times I've been extremely impressed by him. I think he shows really good awareness on the screen game in terms of coming up and being able to fight through blocks to get to that. On the flip side, he did seem to get lost once or twice in coverage down the field. So he's a guy that I think has to make a jump. I don't know how the play turns out, but I think from a style standpoint, there's no question in my mind Florida's going to play a lot more press man next year. All right, let's get to another question. I'm going to pull one from the Swamp 24/7 message boards. Did Dan Mullen want to fire Todd Grantham after last year and he wasn't allowed to, or did Mullen actually want to keep him? So this is a kind of a 2-part question too. From everything that I've been able to report on, Todd Grantham was never going anywhere. And I don't know, looking back on it, I don't really remember how it all unfolded in terms of like the public and what was on Twitter and stuff. I do remember there being a distinct sense from a lot of Florida fans that it was a move that was going to get made. And I never really understood where that was coming from my end. Nothing I've heard indicated that Dan Mullen wanted to move on from Todd Grantham. So I'm not really entirely sure where that came from. Now, the second part of the question, and maybe this is related to that question, that first question, is Jeremy Foley still pulling the strings within the UAA and the athletic department, or is Strickland in full control? Even if Strickland has full control, what type of influence does Foley have, if any? I think this is Scott Strickland's program. I think you look at the top level administrators he's brought in, whether it be Jay Jacobs, Vered Leach, some of the other guys he's brought in around him. He's replaced some of the key positions in terms of, Vered being the guy that's really, really involved in fundraising, and I think Florida's done a terrific job of that, as well as the facilities projects. I've been mostly impressed with everything that Scott Strickland has done. I don't know that he quite has the tone of the fans, and I could be wrong on this, and I'm talking basketball right now. I could be wrong that he doesn't necessarily have the full pulse of the fans in basketball, and maybe I'm overemphasizing what I see on Twitter, what I see on message boards, and I do think that tends to be more of a vocal minority of the fans. But I've talked to a lot of casual Florida basketball fans too that kind of grew up in the Billy Donovan era, that were going to games early in the Billy Donovan era, still have supported, Mike White for the first couple years and are now kind of at their breaking point. So I don't know that, Scott Strickland, everything he's done has been perfect, but I don't think Jeremy Foley really has a whole lot of influence. Sure, he's still around from time to time. I think if there's any quote unquote Jeremy Foley influence, where it's coming from is more, that the UAA is a huge organization And there are a lot of people that have had jobs in the UAA for 20, 30 years, even just 10 years, where the culture is very much established. And, Scott Strickland very much walked into an established culture. And I think a lot of that still lingers in terms of PR, how the program kind of views the fan base, whether the fan base has expectations that are unattainable, maybe a little too high all the time. And I think Florida could do a little bit better job from a departmental standpoint there. But I don't think that Scott Strickland is not in control of this program. I think that's a false narrative. Jeremy Foley is retired now. He definitely still cares about what happens within the Florida program. I can tell you that for a fact. I mean, this is a guy that bled orange and blue, worked his way up, all the way up through the UAA. I mean, he definitely cares, but I don't know that, if he offers Scott Strickland a thought, all of a sudden Scott Strickland's going to change his mind on anything. So, another question from the YouTube chat, again from Victor Core. Florida has struggled running the ball for 2 years now. Well, I think we'll be able to emphasize the run more. Will Florida be able to run better with the losses of Heggie and Forsyth? I think yes, but not because of the personnel on the O-line, if that makes sense. I think Emory Jones' running ability is going to open up the offense quite a bit. When you talk about his quick twitch ability to really cut on a dime, and then I think what people underrate about Emory Jones is he has excellent vision for a runner. He is very, very good at waiting just a split second till that cutback lane opens. And then I think what surprises people is how quickly he sticks his foot in the dirt and is upfield. I mean, he's just a very slippery runner. And I think that's going to help Florida more than anything. The other thing I would say, I think, I'm not sold still. When you got John DeLance still starting on the right side, I think, obviously you have issues. Dan Mullen said he's pretty comfortable with the left side. But I do think you're going to start to see, with a full offseason of strength and conditioning under Nick Savage, I think you're going to see some of these second and third year guys start to make a push. Josh Braun's a guy that I think has a huge upside and can really make a move. Ethan White, if he can stay healthy, he's another guy. I think same thing. So I think you're going to see Florida start to gel a little bit more. I've said this, I think, once or twice before. I think what's going to happen in 2021 is the year we're on, I think. I think what's going to happen in 2021 is going to be very much, you're going to see it like 2018, where initially the Lions got some problems. You see some holes, particularly with a new quarterback. When you were in 2018, you were taking Felipe Franks and putting him into a new system. Emory Jones at least knows the system. The O-line know the system now, but you still got some new personnel. You've still got, some guys that need to get real live game reps under their feet. I think you'll see that kind of slow growth curve where by the end of 2018, Florida was really pretty good running the ball with Jordan Scarlett and P. Ryan and Franks. And you had a pretty, I would say even close to dominant offensive line. Now that group, I think, had a little bit more athletic potential. Martez Ivey's a guy that was on that unit, just signed an NFL contract for a year. So you had a little bit more upside potential maybe than you do with some of these guys. And the guys that I think are capped, from an upside potential standpoint are some of the guys we've talked about. Stuart Reese, John DeLance. What you need to see is those second and third year guys really starting to develop into guys that are going to be your entrenched third, fourth year starters, come 2022, 2023. And if you can get that, that's when I think you really take a big jump. But I think the run game is going to get better. I think it's going to have to by necessity. I mean, you're not going to have Kyle Trask back there, with the ability to pick apart defenses in the same way that they did last year. I think Emory Jones will adjust as a passer, but I think the run game is definitely going to get better. So, Gmail logs, football will be 9-3 this year. Losses to Bama, Georgia, and LSU. Like I said, I think more likely 10-2 than 8-4 to me. I do think 9-3 is probably going to be where Vegas and whatnot sets that over/under line. I'd be a little bit surprised if Florida lost to Bama, Georgia, and LSU. I think Dan Mullen's good enough with game planning that you're going to be able to sneak one of those games at least, even if you're not the favorite. I would put money on that. I bet Florida does not lose Bama, Georgia, and LSU. So quote me on that later. All right, let's get to another question. Bobby Stoops for head coach from the Swamp 24/7 message boards. My question is, what, in your opinion, is holding up Florida from recruiting at an elite level? I think the biggest thing is, to be honest with you, it's the want to. I think Dan Mullen does a ton of things right, and I think in spurts they recruit with real want to. The issue for me is and maybe Blake Alderman in a future episode of the Swamp 24/7 podcast can chime in on this. He has a lot better pulse on recruiting than I do, obviously. But the biggest thing for me is I don't see Florida with that round the clock mentality when it comes to recruiting. You know what I mean? There's assistant coaches, like if you talk like a Travaris Robinson, there are assistant coaches that are literally on their phones 24/7, texting, FaceTiming, chatting, anything that comes up. They're really good at, like, if an event happens, they tie it into, whatever their sales pitch is or their recruiting. Whether that's South Carolina loses a game or like, hey, did you see this coverage? We'd like to run this with you. Just constantly being in contact. And I think, to me, that's where I don't really see Florida being quite as elite as the Georgia, the Alabama, those type of recruiting programs. Obviously those programs to some degree have a little bit of a leg up in terms of Bama's more established, Clemson's more established. It's hard to recruit against that when guys can go in and you're going to get to the playoffs pretty much every year. That's hard to recruit against. I mean, elite prospects want to do that. Florida, that's where I go back to Dan Mullen really needing to make a statement in that game early in the season against Alabama that, hey, we are here to stay. We're a legitimate program. We just need a couple more guys. And then get guys like Jules Montanar, who are super hungry as recruiters, Christian Robinson, that are constantly on guys. The more of those guys you can get, and it doesn't necessarily have to be on the field staff, that obviously helps the most. But a guy like Corey Bell coming in that Florida just hired as an assistant director of player personnel, that's a guy that can help you kind of continue those relationships day to day, constantly being in recruits' ears. To me, that's the biggest thing. I just see this Florida staff one too many times. When other staffs are not quite taking vacations, they're quick to check out. And I'd like to see that change a little bit. I mean, Dan Mullen talked about the thumb wrestling thing. Like, I'm going to beat your ass at whatever it is. If it's thumb wrestling and if it's tic-tac-toe, okay, well, recruiting, I mean, you can trust your evals. And I think Dan Mullen and staff, by and large, do a pretty good job evaluating guys. Now, we're going to find out real soon how good they are at evaluating now that they're going into year 4, and a lot of Dan Mullen recruits are going to be asked to play major roles going forward. But I think the part where they sometimes, to me, don't really check out from that thumb wrestling standpoint, that competitive edge, you look at some of the guys they've gone after, they have lost out on some of the guys, the top 5-star prospect type guys they're going after. So it's not necessarily that they're only going after guys that they trust their evals on, that, are lower rated prospects. They're also just getting beat on 1, 2, 3 too many of those guys per class, the really elite types, especially from the state of Florida. I think that's probably, to me, what has to pick up a little bit. So, guys, if you have comments on any of this stuff, you think I'm wrong in any area or anything, like I said, I want this to be like a chat. It doesn't just have to be a Q&A. You guys can chime in and let me know if you disagree with me on anything. So I definitely encourage that. I want this to be very, back and forth. And I'll take another question. Give me one sec. Whew. All right. From Pragmatic Gator on the Swamp 24/7 message boards. Given some reports that Anthony Richardson did better overall in spring camp compared to Emory, do you think Emory is going to be placed on a leash and Richardson brought in if Emory has an iffy game? Or might it require a few bad games in a row by Emory before Richardson comes in for major snaps? I remember that Trask was brought in place of Franks during one game. I think it's going to look really similar to what we saw the last couple years under, Kyle Trask, where Emory Jones comes in as a change of pace. They use that change of pace quarterback to bring in, if Emory's struggling, they bring him in and say, hey, what are you seeing? Like, what are you seeing out there? What's giving you trouble? And then they can quickly, relay that to the box, and the box can say, hey, this is what they're doing, and then they coach up Emory and bring him back in. I don't think it's going to be a situation, unless Emory plays really poorly, where you really see anything change dramatically. I mean, you've got Alabama in game 3, so I think Dan Mullen and his staff, the way they're going to approach it is very much try to build confidence for Emory in those first 2 games. And then you give him the reins against Alabama and say, hey, man, you've worked for this. You've been on the big stage against Georgia. You've been on the big stage against LSU. You had that series against Auburn where you're on the big stage, top 10 game. It's yours full time now. And they'll give it to him. And I think unless he's really, really bad, I think he's going to get a pretty long leash. I just don't think you develop and groom a guy for 3 years and then risk the blow to his confidence that you would take by having a quick trigger with him, especially in a game against like an Alabama, where you may also ruin the younger guy's confidence. Does that make sense? Like, I don't think you can afford to be quick on the trigger early in the season with guys that are young, because there's no guarantee, even if Anthony Richardson is outperforming Emory in practice, and we really don't know that. Our reporting was basically that Emory kind of struggled with timing and accuracy in the first 2 scrimmages, but kind of got it together by the 3rd scrimmage. We didn't hear quite as much on Anthony Richardson. That doesn't necessarily mean that he wasn't better. But I just think the way Dan Mullen has developed quarterbacks, I think it's safe to say that this is going to be Emory Jones's team, and they're going to kind of let him go. And I see Jacob agrees with that. Uh, I just think that they'd have to be really bad to full out pull the plug and go to Richardson. Now, again, I think Anthony Richardson, he'll get involved in spurts, no doubt. I think they're going to have packages for him even in that Alabama game. I mean, that's what Mullen likes to do, right? He likes to build them up, get their confidence in those big stages, and then at some point, if you get towards the middle of the schedule where Emory has a bad game against LSU and Anthony Richardson's been pretty promising, then maybe you reevaluate and say, hey, we've got a bye week before Georgia. Georgia hasn't really seen Anthony Richardson. He's done good things for us. His confidence is high. Maybe let's try him. But I don't see anything happening early season. I don't think it's going to be like Emory struggles in game 1 or game 2 and they quickly pull him to try to get to Richardson before the Alabama game. To me, there's no way that happens. So keep dropping some comments in the chat, guys. It looks like we're almost running out of questions on the Swamp 24/7 message board. So let's see what we got here. Speaking of Emory, what are your expectations for him? Mullen's first QB recruit, a guy who has waited for his turn and hopefully developed a high-rated recruit too. I think Emory's in a bit of a tough spot next year because they lose so many playmakers that not only is Emory stepping into a situation where he's going to have to adapt on the fly quite a bit, he's also got a situation where Florida's staff is still going to be finding out what they have and who's exactly as reliable as they think they are in terms of the skill guys. And so that's going to be a little bit of an interesting thing to watch. You have the stylistic change in offense from kind of expecting to go to more of a run heavy offense. But you also have to figure out the personnel and who's doing what the best. So I think people are going to have to be patient with Emory. Again, you've got Alabama in game 3. So there's a very strong chance that, Emory looks a little shaky, maybe game 1 and 2. And then, things could go really poorly against Alabama. I mean, they just could. I mean, that's a possible scenario. So I think people need to be patient with him. I do think that he's going to develop. I think he's a very coachable guy. And I think that his development, especially in the third scrimmage of the spring, was very positive. I think that now that Dan Mullen has all that tape from the spring, they're really going to be able to sit down and kind of pick apart, hey, here's what we want to do. Here's what we need to steer away from. And I think, on the same token, they have that information about the skill guys now, too. So this offseason is going to put a lot on Dan Mullen and his staff to really try to piece things together and piece them together quickly. JetMech says by week 4, everyone will be calling for Anthony Richardson to start. I mean, maybe. I don't, maybe. I'm not fully sold on Emory Jones yet. I'll be the first one to tell you that. I've seen enough of him in practice to where I have legitimate concerns about his accuracy. But I do think it's just the offense is going to look so different that I think you're going to have patience to see what it looks like. Because I do think, again, he's going to add so much with his ability to run. And then you talk about, the athleticism of a guy like Zipper. Maybe you can mix him in and some of those looks we saw with like Aaron Hernandez on the shovel pass. I do think Florida's got a really, really talented stable of running backs. And, who knows? Florida could come out running 2-back sets all next year and really, really stress defenses in the front 7. And all of a sudden that opens up, one-on-one deep shots for Emory where, or Emory can scramble around in the pocket. I think I've made this comparison before. I wouldn't be surprised if at least like kind of early in the year, you see a lot of Emory Jones's big plays being stuff that we saw like Treon Harris do. Where he really had a really, really good connection with Antonio Callaway. And anytime the play broke down, it was like Antonio Callaway knew exactly where, Treon Harris would want him to be. They kind of had that rapport. I don't know who that guy with Emory would be necessarily, but I think you're going to see him kind of have that same, when things break down, it's going to be some playground football, and that can be fun for fans too. So let's see what else we got in the chat. FSU coach has already recruited more 5-stars than Mullen has in all 4 years at Florida. I guess we're not counting the transfer portal. I mean, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but Dan Mullen's pulled quite a few from the transfer portal, and the way that rosters are built these days, I don't know that you can ignore that. So, still don't have a Pitts, Grimes, or Van Jefferson. You definitely don't have a Pitts. I mean, that's for sure, 100%. That's not going to happen again in a long time. I don't think. Maybe Eric Gilbert could have been that guy, but even then, I mean, that's it's potential compared to what we saw at a Pitts, which was the real deal. I think that they could very well have a guy that could replace a Trayvon Grimes. I heard very good things out of Jaquavian Frazier's, out of Xavier Henderson. I'm really curious to see Jamarcus Weston because he's never particularly stood out to me. But Dan Mullen raves about him. I mean, really, the first time he signed the guy, he said this is going to be, the guy that nobody's talking about now. That's the star. I'm curious to see him because he's another one of those guys that to me has to prove it to me from what I've seen so far. But I think Florida's got some guys. I mean, Xavier Henderson was a guy that everybody was after, and Jaquavian Frazier's was really, really good. At the All-Star game. So I think Florida's got some guys. That's where I go back to. I think you're going to have to be very patient early in the season. I don't think fans should freak out. Again, if Florida loses to Alabama, yeah, that's going to be 4 losses in the last 6 games. But you're talking about a completely different team. I think you got to kind of separate it in that context and understand, this is a different year where Dan Mullen's breaking in the first quarterback that he's kind of groomed. And I don't care how good a coach Dan Mullen is, that's going to take some time. I mean, you see some things in games as a starting quarterback that you don't see. You run into situations that you haven't been in. You don't know how you're going to react. The coach doesn't know how you're going to react. And so until you go through them, I think people are going to need to be patient. One more question from Victor Core. What are your thoughts on the ability of this staff to recruit for football? Do you think it will get better, and what separates us from the top tier? We touched on that a little bit. I think, again, it's just that relentless desire. I think because Florida is so established in terms of what it's got from a coaching staff in terms of an evaluation standpoint and the ability to develop, and I'm talking about guys like Billy Gonzalez, Greg Knox, John Hevesy, I don't think those guys are going anywhere. I mean, I just think Dan Mullen knows his system and is so comfortable with his offensive system. Those guys are here for the long haul. So really, you're only talking about, to me, the ability to upgrade comes from 1 or 2 places. One being those last few assistants that, maybe are a little bit more interchangeable on the staff. That being, a guy like Larry Scott, who you brought in, Tim Brewster, the 2 secondary coaches that departed. You brought in Jules Montanar and Wesley McGriff. I think Montanar is definitely going to be an upgrade in terms of a recruiter, even though I thought Torian Gray was pretty good. I'm not as sure on McGriff. Blake would probably be able to give you a better answer on that right now. But to me, unless it's really, there's only 1 or 2 assistant spots you can upgrade that I think Dan Mullen actually will upgrade. And so that would be one way. And the other way is just top down, man. The message has to come from Dan Mullen that, hey, either, I don't know whether that's his feeder to the fire because of pressure from the fan base, pressure on his job. I don't know what would make him suddenly flip that switch, but Florida just has to be more night and day recruiting, eat, sleep, and breathe recruiting. And unfortunately, we have not seen that right now from Florida. I don't think to this point. I do think, again, one thing we've talked about, Florida does a lot better when they can have guys in person, face to face. They are one of the programs that's really struggling with the virtual stuff because Florida staff just doesn't. Again, they don't do that virtual, constant text messaging, twittering. They don't do it as well as some other staffs, just point blank. So to me, that's kind of where it's got to pick up. Let's see if we got any more in the Swamp 24/7 message board. Looks like no. A couple more from the YouTube chat, and then we'll probably call it a day for this video. Scott Strickland, Dan Mullen, Todd Grantham. Yeah, okay. I'm not sure it's a Mississippi State mentality, Cooley, to be honest with you. We'll see. I mean, I think Scott Strickland, at least from a mentality standpoint, is clearly trying to get Florida's facilities into, the top tier of college athletics. And I think he's done a really good job. I think one thing that, if you're talking about things you need to credit Scott Strickland for, the old plan to build the football standalone facility where the track pit was basically where the throwing area was for the track, that was going to be an absolute disaster. I mean, they were talking about building a 3-story building there in like a really, really compressed spot that could, let me put it this way. If you haven't been in that area, the spot they were going to put it in essentially was like big enough to hold like 20 cars when reporters would come to Florida's basketball media day. And they were going to, and their plan was just to build it like 3 stories tall, right? That was going to be an awful idea. The plan to scrap that completely, build a brand new baseball stadium, and then allow, the space that you'll have to build the new football facility, that's one of the best decisions Scott Strickland has made as an athletics director. Now, he's going to face some tough ones coming up, I think, with, the pressure on Mike White, the pressure on Dan Mullen in the next few years. But, dude, I'm terrible at guitar, just going to tell you. But I think, I think the bigger thing is I think they're pushing Florida in the right direction. I think the one thing I don't know if they have right now is the ruthlessness. And that starts with, I think it starts with Dan Mullen, needing to make those, absolute pivotal changes that you would see a guy like Nick Saban or Urban Meyer make. I'm not sure that's going to happen. And at that point, it becomes, okay, well, when do you establish, like, how long in do you give Dan Mullen if you're Scott Strickland, to say, okay, this is our ceiling. Can we ever get past it? And then once you make that judgment, how quick are you to maybe pull the trigger? I don't think we're there yet. Like I said earlier in this video, I think there's no question that Dan Mullen's going to get a 5th year, almost regardless of what happens next year. I think that Scott Strickland is very much looking for a guy that can build a foundation, a program like an Alabama, like a Clemson. He's not looking for a coach that can come in and win a title, maybe even win 2 titles, and then the whole thing falls apart. Scott Strickland very much, I think, values his legacy. He's very well thought of in the athletic department industry. But I just think you're going to see more patience. I don't think they have a Mississippi State approach at all. I think, if anything, if it comes off like they have a Mississippi State approach, that's because he's taken a long view, and he's going to give these coaches a little bit of time until all the facilities are in place, until they prove definitively one way or the other that they're not the guy. So let's get to it. Urban Meyer's offense has always needed a strong O-line. If Mullen wants to go back to that formula, he needs a better O-line. I don't disagree at all on that, and I think that's one of the biggest things that has been holding Florida back for a little bit. I think that Florida has very much, if you look at their recruiting on the O-line, what they've tried to do is exactly what Meyer did when he was at Florida, is go for those big, massive guys, and then you kind of work with them from there. And, I'm talking Ethan White, Josh Braun, Stuart Reese. They just want meat. John Hevesy always says mass kicks ass, and what he wants is guys that are maybe almost a little too big in the high school ranks and maybe get overlooked because of that, but actually have pretty good athleticism. And you talk about a guy like Ethan White, and Josh Braun was the tennis player, and Braun wasn't overlooked at all, don't get me wrong. But Florida tries to recruit those big guys and then just get guys that can move. You know what I mean? I think that, again, with recruiting, I go back to Florida's been after some of these higher rated O-line and just missed on them. So it's not like they're only taking, the under the radar guys, a la the Ethan Whites. I just think they have to get better recruiting. I mean that's, like you said, that's Meyer needed a strong offensive line to have that system work. I think there's no question that Dan Mullen does as well. I do think 2020, 2019 showed us that they're very adaptable if you have the right guy at quarterback. The concern I have is that, when you talk about the programs that are winning national titles, there's basically 2 ways to do it, right? And a lot of these programs do both. You either recruit at the Alabama, Clemson, Georgia, Ohio State level, or you have a game-breaking quarterback like a Trevor Lawrence, and a lot of those programs do both. So my concern is that Dan Mullen had his game-breaking quarterback in Kyle Trask last year, and unfortunately, like you said, because the O-line wasn't as strong, that cost him a little bit. And it's hard to fault the offense for last year. I mean, the defense obviously shares a lot more blame for that. But I do think, that's definitely the formula. So what do you think will start who do you think will start at the star position? Right now, I'm pretty confident that Trevez Johnson's going to be the guy there. One guy I think you really should keep an eye on is Jordan Young. He's a guy that's going to, I think, push for that backup spot. I was reasonably high on Kamar Wilcoxon last year, but I think Trevez Johnson, because of his experience and just the knowledge that Florida puts on those stars, I think he's the guy, for the foreseeable future. He's a guy that obviously was really, really highly thought of coming out of high school. The rating services like 24/7 Sports probably caught on a little bit late, and 24/7 was actually higher on Trevez than the industry. But he's a guy that really, honestly, probably should have been ranked a lot higher. And Florida was in on him from the absolute very start. He's a guy that got experience last year, has some real hitting ability, but I think his ability to process too. Because if from a kind of a scheme standpoint, what Florida likes to do in the secondary, Todd Grantham plays a lot of pattern match coverage. And what that means is a lot of time your nickelback or your safety is reading, whether it's a 3x1, 2x2 set, and they're keying their read, whether it's zone or man on that side of the ball, to what that receiver's doing. And so it takes a very, very quick, sharp, high football IQ guy. And I think Trevez has shown that so far. Obviously definitely wasn't perfect last year, but there were so many more issues going on with the secondary than just, a young guy trying to play a really hard position. I think the fact that Florida put Trevez there last year shows you how confident in him the Florida staff is. Given his buyout, is it even possible for Strickland to think about getting rid of Mike White? I think if you don't think he's the guy, yeah. I think Scott Strickland's comments the other day on, the Steve Russell show in Gainesville on local radio made it very clear he's nowhere close to thinking Mike White's not the guy. And to me, that's concerning because I just see so many little things with Mike White where you could point to and say that's not, a good coach would have figured this out a little bit sooner. I think he's an extremely intelligent guy. Again, X's and O's wise, I think he knows what he's doing. I just think it gets lost in translation with these college guys. And then when you have as much roster turnover as they do, you're trying to piece together so many different things. Something you thought was going to work. We hear Mike White say this all the time. Something they thought was going to work didn't. And again, there's a lot of valid reasons for that. Keontae Johnson going down in game 4 absolutely changed the identity of what this team would be. But I think the bigger issue, going back to your question, it's not necessarily that Mike White would have a $7 million buyout this year. I mean, if he's not the guy, I think Scott Strickland would make the call. He just doesn't believe that he's not the guy. I mean, that's as simple as that. He thinks Mike White is the guy. And then he also thinks patience pays off. And, I talked about it in one of the videos, and I'll go back after this and link the video here. There's a lot of bad examples that have been, in my opinion, bad examples that have been made. Scott Drew, Mark Few, how long they were at their programs before they really reached the pinnacle of college basketball. Yeah, very different situations in both of those. Baylor was an absolute disaster of a program coming off NCAA sanctions, the whole Dave Bliss mess. I mean, it was a disaster. So, of course, he was going to get time. Mark Few won 5 conference titles and 5 conference tourney titles in his first 5 years. I don't know how long, I don't know when the math might change for Scott Strickland. I think Mike White, again, I think he's going to put together a really good roster on paper next year, but it's not going to be the first time he's had a really good roster on paper. So how does he get it to mesh? How does he put it all together? We're going to see. I mean, I think it's going to be really interesting. I don't think, my sense from Scott Strickland is not that money's ever going to stand in the way of an issue. I mean, look at Jim McElwain. I mean, they really took a hit on Jim McElwain pretty early in his tenure because Scott Strickland didn't like the way Jim McElwain operated the program. He thought he was very disrespectful to Strickland, didn't have the right culture fit, and he made the move. So I think the bigger issue is that Scott Strickland believes in Mike White. And at that point, Scott Strickland will begin to put his reputation on the line, as these two coaches for the major sports that everyone cares about continue to show what they're capable of. Let's check the Swamp 24/7 thread. Again, nothing there. So 1 or 2 more questions here, and then we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Do we got any more? Let's see. Wish we could contract out our recruiting to a private company. Dude, I'm telling you, if you guys, if Florida was able to do that, I guarantee you there are 5 or 6 people on the Swamp 24/7 message board that would not only actually be pretty good at scouting recruits, but would be fantastic at being on the phone with them every day, contacting them. And dude, it takes a special breed of a person to really want to do that recruiting job. They don't pay a whole lot. I mean, these guys are not, the guys that are in the recruiting office that are like responsible for being on the phone with these guys 24/7. They don't get paid a ton, man. It's a thankless job. These guys are working 80, 90, 100-hour weeks sometimes. I think there's 100 hours in a week, yeah. But they are constantly working. So, but yeah, I mean, it'd be an interesting idea. I think that's where, I think the hires like Corey Bell really help. And we'll see if Florida can continue to do that. All right, last question here from Jet Mech. Do you have any insight on what coaches and ADs think will change with name, image, likeness? Could you cover that topic in a later show? Yes, that's an excellent idea for a podcast topic. I think first and foremost, I think from a coach's standpoint, and I'll speak to that because I've talked to a lot more coaches than necessarily athletics directors. Coaches are very concerned that it's going to exacerbate what is already a struggle for many in recruiting, and it's exactly what I'm talking about. Exactly why I think Florida is maybe not quite as elite as some of these other schools in recruiting. They're not constantly 24/7 on the phones, on the Twitter with these kids. And I think the concern is when you start having this name, image, and likeness, it's really going to be a little bit of a free-for-all. How they structure it, I think, is going to be very important. But if you're in let's be honest, even with the current system and the current rules, there's tampering that goes on all the time with recruits. Guys that are maybe dissatisfied at the school they're at and they're not officially in the transfer portal or anything like that, but they're talking through either, fellow teammates that they had in high school, through different connections they have to other programs. I'll just leave it at that. There's frequently recruiting tampering that goes on. Now, when you have the ability to pay players for their image and likeness, I think there's a couple things that could happen. I think it could create a lot of headaches in that way. I also think it could potentially help local recruiting for everybody and allow you to keep more guys home, right? Because if you're, a guy from the Jacksonville area, you're a big star, Byron Cowart from the Tampa area, your chance for endorsements are probably a lot better at a place like Florida than if you go to Ohio State or Michigan. Not that you can't get them there, but I do think you might start to see more guys stay home locally when name, image, and likeness comes up. I think it's going to be a big deal. I think it's going to benefit the bigger schools, the brand name schools like Florida very well. And, Florida's in good shape too in that the state moved very quickly getting through its name, image, and likeness. And so Florida's had a lot more time to think about this and begin planning for it. That's one area I think if you're talking about how Florida can recruit better, Dan Mullen and his staff, if they have a good plan for name, image, and likeness, they can really take a big jump forward and maybe start to close some of that recruiting gap if they know what they're doing. So we'll go ahead and end the show there, guys. I appreciate all the questions. As we continue to do this more and more, I think I'll get more comfortable with the flow of the chat and kind of, getting it a little bit more to a real time where you guys can kind of chime in while I'm in the middle of answering and I can, feel that out. But I appreciate everybody that tuned in, guys. I thought it went really well for a first run of a live Q&A. We'll definitely do more of these and hope you guys have a great day. Thanks for tuning in.